The humidity hung like a weight upon his shoulders. Private First Class Michael Torres wiped the sweat from his brow and took another step forward, his boots sinking into the soft earth of the Mekong Delta. The year was 1968, and he was 20 years old. Around him the jungle breathed with 1,000 unseen eyes. His platoon moved in single file through the dense vegetation, each man keeping exactly 5 meters from the one ahead. The rules were simple. Too close, and a single grenade could eliminate half the squad. Too far, and the jungle would swallow you whole. Torres had learned these lessons in his first week. Now, 3 months into his tour, he understood something far more terrifying. The enemy he faced did not always carry a rifle. Sergeant William Hayes raised his fist, and the column froze. 17 men stood motionless in the green cathedral of bamboo and elephant grass, their ears straining against the symphony of insects and distant artillery. Hayes knelt slowly, his eyes fixed on something ahead. Torres watched as the sergeant reached into the undergrowth with practiced caution and lifted a thin strand of wire, almost invisible against the foliage. A tripwire, connected to what they could not yet see. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict America had ever fought. The battlefields of Europe and the Pacific had been brutal, but they operated on principles soldiers understood. Armies faced armies, tanks faced tanks. Artillery answered artillery. But in the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia, the rules of warfare had been rewritten in ways that would haunt a generation. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army possessed an arsenal that would become legendary for its ingenuity and terror. These were not always sophisticated weapons of modern industry. Many were crafted from salvaged materials, improvised from the refuse of a more technologically advanced enemy, or designed with nothing more than bamboo, iron, and an intimate knowledge of human fear. What made these weapons so feared was not merely their lethality. It was their invisibility, their patience, their ability to transform every step into a potential death sentence. Sergeant Hayes traced the tripwire to its source and found what he expected. A buried artillery shell, American-made, repurposed into an improvised explosive device. The Viet Cong had become masters of recycling the tools of their enemy. Unexploded ordnance, dud bombs, discarded ammunition, all were collected, modified, and returned with deadly efficiency. But the explosives were only part of the equation. Torres remembered his first encounter with a punji pit 3 weeks into his deployment. Private Rodriguez had been walking point when the ground simply opened beneath him. The scream that followed was something Torres would never forget, a sound that began as surprise and transformed into agony within a single breath. The pit was 3 feet deep, lined with sharpened bamboo stakes. The stakes had been fire-hardened to increase their strength and smeared with human feces, ensuring that even a survivable wound would become infected within days. Rodriguez had landed with both legs impaled, the stakes piercing through his boots and deep into his calves. Extraction took 45 minutes. Rodriguez survived, but he would never walk without a limp again. The punji stake was perhaps the most primitive weapon in the Viet Cong arsenal, yet it was devastatingly effective. These traps required no technology, no imported materials, no supply lines that could be bombed or interdicted. They required only bamboo, time, and the patience to dig. A single Viet Cong soldier could construct dozens in a single night, seeding the landscape with invisible danger. The psychological impact far exceeded the physical casualties. American soldiers began to fear the ground itself. Every step became an act of calculated risk. Trails that appeared safe often proved the most dangerous, their well-worn paths inviting weary feet into carefully concealed death. The variants were numerous. Some punji traps were designed to wound the foot, angling stakes upward to pierce through the sole. Others targeted the legs or torso. The most feared were the swinging traps, spring-loaded mechanisms that would drive stakes horizontally into a soldier's body when triggered. These could pierce flak jackets, helmets and flesh with equal ease. Torres learned to read the jungle differently. He learned to notice when vegetation had been recently disturbed, when leaves had been arranged too carefully, when the texture of the path changed subtly beneath his feet. He learned that survival required becoming something other than a soldier. It required becoming a student of the ground itself, but the traps were only the beginning. The bouncing Betty was a different kind of horror. When triggered, this anti-personnel mine would launch itself to waist height before detonating, spraying shrapnel in a 360-degree pattern designed to maximize casualties. A single bouncing Betty could wound or kill every man within a 20-meter radius. The sound of the initial launch, a soft metallic click followed by a whisper of ascending metal, became one of the most dreaded sounds a soldier could hear. Those who recognized it had approximately 1 second to react. Most did not recognize it in time. The Viet Cong obtained these mines through various means. Some were captured from American forces. Others were purchased through international arms dealers. Still others were manufactured locally, copied from captured examples with remarkable precision. The guerrillas had developed an entire cottage industry of weapons production, hidden in the tunnels and villages that dotted the Vietnamese countryside. As Torres and his platoon carefully disarmed the improvised explosive and continued their patrol, he understood something that would take years to fully articulate. The weapons he faced were not merely tools of war, they were statements of philosophy. They communicated a willingness to fight on terms that negated American advantages in firepower, mobility, and technology. They said, in the language of sharpened bamboo and buried explosives, that this war would be won not through superior force, but through superior patience. The jungle closed around the patrol as they moved deeper into enemy territory. Above, the canopy blocked the sun, creating a perpetual twilight that seemed to exist outside of time. Torres kept his eyes on the ground, his ears tuned to any sound that did not belong, his mind calculating the 1,000 ways death might be waiting in the next step. He was learning what every American soldier in Vietnam eventually learned. In this war, the most dangerous weapon was often the one you never saw coming. The Viet Cong had turned the landscape itself into an arsenal, and against that arsenal, all the firepower of the most powerful military in history sometimes felt terrifyingly inadequate. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These stories reveal the hidden truths of history that textbooks never taught you, the human experiences behind the headlines, the fears behind the courage. Subscribe now so you never miss a story that will change how you see the past. The morning of March 14th, 1967, began like any other in the village of Trang Bang. Farmers walked their water buffalo to the rice paddies as the mist rose from the fields. Children played in the dusty streets while their mothers prepared the day's first meal. The war, though ever present in rumor and distant thunder, had not yet touched this particular corner of South Vietnam directly. By noon, everything would change. Captain James Morrison sat in the co-pilot seat of the F-4 Phantom, watching the landscape scroll beneath him at 400 knots. The briefing had been straightforward. Intelligence indicated a significant Viet Cong presence in the target area. His mission was to deliver ordnance on suspected enemy positions using the weapon that had become synonymous with the Vietnam War: napalm. The word itself had become a kind of shorthand for the moral complexity of the conflict. Developed during World War II and refined through the Korean War, napalm was an incendiary weapon unlike any other. Its basic chemistry was deceptively simple, a mixture of naphthenic and palmitic acids combined with gasoline to create a gel that would stick to surfaces and burn at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But the chemistry told only part of the story. Morrison had delivered napalm strikes before. He knew what the weapon did. He knew how it transformed landscapes into infernos, how it sucked oxygen from the air and created firestorms that could be seen for miles. He knew, though he tried not to think about it too deeply, what it did to human beings caught in its path. The Phantom descended through scattered clouds as Morrison's pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harris, aligned their approach vector. Below, the jungle canopy appeared as an unbroken sea of green, hiding whatever lay beneath. The target coordinates had been provided by forward observers, but in this war, coordinates were often approximations. The enemy moved constantly, blending with the civilian population, emerging only to strike before vanishing back into the landscape. This uncertainty was part of what made napalm both so effective and so controversial. Where conventional bombs required precision to destroy specific targets, napalm created zones of destruction that denied entire areas to the enemy. It could clear landing zones in minutes, eliminate concealed positions, and destroy tunnel entrances that would otherwise require ground troops to assault at terrible cost. The military logic was compelling. Napalm saved American lives by eliminating threats before soldiers had to face them directly. A single airstrike could accomplish what might otherwise require days of dangerous ground operations. In the calculus of war, this was considered an acceptable trade. But the calculus did not account for everything. Morrison felt the aircraft shudder as the napalm canisters released, tumbling toward the earth in a trajectory that physics made inevitable. He did not look back. He never looked back. The Phantom climbed away from the target area as the canisters struck the ground and erupted into consuming flame. On the ground, the reality of napalm was experienced in ways that no briefing could adequately convey. Private First Class. David Chen was part of a Marine patrol operating 3 kilometers from the strike zone. He heard the jets first, the distinctive scream of the Phantom's engines cutting through the jungle's ambient noise. Then he saw the orange glow through the canopy. A sunrise in the wrong direction, followed by a wave of heat that reached him even at that distance. The Marines had been told to expect the strike. They had been told it would soften enemy positions before their advance. What they had not been told, what no one could adequately tell them, was what they would find when they moved through the aftermath. The first thing Chen noticed was the silence. The jungle, normally alive with birds and insects and the rustling of countless unseen creatures, had gone completely still. The second thing he noticed was the smell, a combination of burned vegetation, fuel, and something else that his mind refused to identify. The patrol moved cautiously through the devastated landscape. Trees stood as blackened skeletons, their leaves reduced to ash that still drifted through the air like grey snow. The ground itself was scorched, the earth baked hard in some places and still smouldering in others. Nothing green remained, and then they found the bodies. Chen would later try to describe what he saw to a psychiatrist at the VA hospital. He would search for words that could convey the horror without recounting the specific details that still invaded his dreams decades later. He would fail. Some things existed beyond the reach of language. The Viet Cong had been dug in along a tree line when the napalm struck. Those who had been directly hit had simply ceased to exist as recognizable human beings. But it was those who had been caught at the edges of the inferno who presented the most disturbing sights. Napalm did not merely burn, it adhered. It stuck to skin and continued burning, even as its victims ran, rolled, or plunged into water. The wounds it created were unlike anything conventional burns could produce. Chen understood in that moment why napalm was so feared by both sides of the conflict. American soldiers feared being caught by friendly fire, a possibility that was all too real given the imprecision of airstrikes and the fluid nature of jungle combat. The Viet Cong feared it as the embodiment of American technological superiority, a weapon against which their courage, their determination, and their willingness to sacrifice meant nothing. The psychological impact of napalm extended far beyond its immediate casualties. Villages that had experienced napalm attacks or merely heard stories of them became susceptible to a particular kind of terror. The sound of approaching aircraft could empty entire communities within minutes, sending farmers and families fleeing into the jungle, where they were equally vulnerable to the traps and ambushes that both sides had seeded throughout the landscape. This displacement served military purposes. It denied the Viet Cong the civilian infrastructure they depended upon, the food, shelter, and intelligence that villages provided. But it also created a population of refugees whose suffering became a recruiting tool for the very enemy America was trying to defeat. The fire consumed everything in its path, indifferent to the distinctions that mattered so much to the humans caught in its flames. Combatant and civilian, guilty and innocent, the intended target and the accidental victim, napalm made no such discriminations. It simply burned. By 1968, American forces had dropped approximately 400,000 tons of napalm on Vietnam. The scale was difficult to comprehend. It represented a campaign of deliberate incineration unprecedented in the history of warfare, a systematic attempt to deny the enemy any refuge by eliminating the landscape itself. Captain Morrison completed his mission that day and returned to base. His sortie was logged as successful, the target area assessed as neutralized. He would fly dozens more missions before rotating home, each one adding to a psychological weight he would carry for the rest of his life. Years later, he would see a photograph that became one of the most iconic images of the war. A 9-year-old girl running naked down a road, her clothes and much of her skin burned away by napalm, her face contorted in unimaginable agony. The photograph would win a Pulitzer Prize. It would come to symbolize everything terrible about the conflict. And Morrison would wonder, though he could never know for certain, whether he had been flying one of the aircraft in the sky above that road. The fear of napalm was not irrational. It was not propaganda. It was the recognition of a weapon that had crossed some invisible line in the ethics of warfare, a weapon that transformed human beings into fuel, that turned the air itself into an enemy, that created suffering so extreme that death became a mercy. And yet the bombs continued to fall. The military necessity was clear. The moral cost was beginning to be counted. And somewhere in the space between those two realities, a generation of young men learned to live with what they had seen and done in the skies above Vietnam. The fire from the sky had become one of the most feared weapons of the war, not because of its military effectiveness, though that was substantial, but because of what it revealed about the lengths to which nations would go in pursuit of victory, and about the price that both sides, and the civilians caught between them, would ultimately pay. Specialist Fourth Class Marcus Williams heard it before he saw anything, a distinctive sound that every American soldier in Vietnam learned to recognize and fear, the sharp, staccato crack of the AK-47 assault rifle echoing through the jungle like the hammer of fate striking again and again. He threw himself into the nearest depression in the ground, a shallow crater left by some forgotten mortar round, as bullets tore through the vegetation above his head. Around him, his squad was doing the same, diving, rolling, seeking whatever cover the landscape offered. They had been ambushed, caught in what military planners called a kill zone, though the clinical terminology did nothing to capture the terror of the experience. The AK-47, officially designated as the Avtomat Kalashnikova, this Soviet-designed assault rifle had become the defining weapon of the opposing force. It was not the most accurate rifle ever made. It was not the most powerful. It did not have the range of the American M14 or the rate of fire of the M60 machine gun. What it possessed was something far more important in the conditions of jungle warfare. It was almost indestructible. Williams had heard the stories during training. The AK-47 could be buried in mud, submerged in water, dropped from helicopters, and dragged through swamps. It could fire thousands of rounds without cleaning. It could be disassembled and reassembled by a child, and often was, in the villages where the Viet Cong recruited. Its mechanical simplicity was its genius, a design philosophy that prioritized reliability over precision. In the jungles of Vietnam, that philosophy proved devastatingly effective. The ambush had been perfectly executed. The Viet Cong had allowed Williams' squad to enter the kill zone before opening fire from concealed positions on 3 sides. The initial volley had caught 2 men before anyone could react. Now, the survivors were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat, while the distinctive sound of AK-47 fire continued to shred the jungle around them. Williams understood why the weapon was so feared. It was not merely its mechanical excellence or its lethal capability. It was what it represented, an enemy who could fight with weapons that matched or exceeded American technology, supplied by a global network of communist allies who seemed willing to provide unlimited materiel. For every AK-47 destroyed or captured, 10 more appeared. For every Viet Cong fighter killed, 2 more seemed to take his place. The psychological warfare of the AK-47 extended beyond its use in combat. The weapon had a distinctive sound that could not be mistaken for American firearms. In the confusion of jungle combat, where visibility might be measured in meters and friend could not always be distinguished from foe, that sound served as a kind of signature. It announced the enemy's presence, declared his intent, and reminded American soldiers that they were fighting an opponent who was neither primitive nor poorly equipped. "Contact left!" someone screamed, and Williams shifted his position to face a new threat. The Viet Cong were moving, trying to close the trap completely. This was their way of war, not the set-piece battles that American doctrine preferred, but ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and the patient application of pressure designed to bleed rather than defeat. The M16 rifle that Williams carried was, in many ways, superior to the AK-47. It was more accurate, lighter, and designed to the highest standards of American manufacturing. But in the early years of the war, the M16 had suffered from a devastating flaw. It jammed. In the humid, dirty conditions of Vietnam, the rifle's tighter tolerances became a liability. Soldiers died with their weapons disassembled, trying desperately to clear malfunctions while enemy fire cut them down. The Army had eventually addressed the problem through modifications and improved maintenance procedures, but the reputation had been established. The AK-47 always worked. The M16 sometimes didn't. In the arithmetic of survival, that sometimes was enough to inspire fear. Williams returned fire, watching his tracers disappear into the vegetation without any indication of effect. The enemy was invisible, hidden in positions they had prepared days or weeks in advance. They knew this terrain intimately. They had grown up in these jungles, learned to move through them as naturally as breathing. The American soldiers, despite their superior training and equipment, were visitors in a hostile land. The ambush continued for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 15 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the firing stopped. Williams held his position, waiting for the next phase of the attack, but none came. The Viet Cong had achieved their objective. Casualties inflicted, ammunition expended, terror reinforced, and had melted back into the jungle from which they had emerged. When the squad finally assembled to assess the damage, they found 3 dead and 2 wounded. The dead had been killed in the opening seconds of the ambush. The wounded would survive, though one would lose most of his right hand to a round that had struck his weapon while he was trying to return fire. Williams looked at the jungle around him. It appeared unchanged, indifferent to the violence that had just occurred. Somewhere out there, the men who had attacked them were already moving to their next position, their AK-47s cleaned and ready, their patience infinite, their commitment absolute. This was the weapon that embodied the enemy's approach to the war, not technology for its own sake, but technology in service of a larger strategy. The AK-47 was reliable because reliability mattered more than precision when you were fighting a guerrilla war. It was simple because simplicity meant that peasants could become soldiers within weeks. It was everywhere because the Soviet Union and China had decided that arming the Vietnamese was worth any cost. The fear of the AK-47 was the fear of an enemy who could not be defeated by superior firepower alone. It was the recognition that in this war, the rules had been changed in ways that American military planners had never anticipated. And it was the understanding that survival required adapting to those rules or dying by them. Williams' squad continued their patrol, moving now with the exaggerated caution of men who had just learned that death could come from any direction without warning. The jungle remained silent, but that silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the held breath of a predator waiting for its next opportunity. If this story is touching something deep inside you, pause right now and leave a comment saying, "War never dies in the hearts of those who lived it." Let me know you're here, that you understand what these men faced, and that their stories will not be forgotten. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, no relation to David Chen from the earlier patrol, though they might have passed each other in Saigon without knowing, stood at the entrance to the tunnel and felt a fear unlike anything her training had prepared her for. She was an army nurse, not a combat soldier, but the war had brought her here nonetheless, to a captured tunnel complex near Cu Chi that the brass wanted documented for intelligence purposes. The darkness below was absolute. The tunnels of Vietnam represented one of the most remarkable military achievements in the history of warfare. They were not merely hiding places or simple dugouts. They were entire underground cities, complete with hospitals, armories, kitchens, and living quarters. They stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the Vietnamese countryside, connecting villages, military bases, and staging areas in a network that American forces could never fully map or destroy. Sergeant First Class Robert Johnson had been a tunnel rat, one of the specially selected soldiers whose job was to enter these underground networks and clear them of enemy combatants. He was small, as tunnel rats had to be, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and wiry in build. He had volunteered for the duty because it paid better than regular infantry work, and because at 22 years old he had believed himself invincible. He no longer believed that. "The first thing you notice is the smell," he would tell fellow soldiers who asked about the tunnels. "It's not like anything on the surface. It's earth and sweat and smoke and something else, something that tells you people have been living and dying down there for years. The smell gets into your clothes, your skin, your dreams. You never really get it out." Johnson had made 17 tunnel descents. Each one had been a journey into a kind of hell that surface dwellers could barely imagine. The tunnels were narrow, sometimes less than 2 feet in width, and often required crawling on one's belly through passages that seemed designed to trigger every claustrophobic instinct humans possessed. The air was thick and hot, often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility was essentially zero. Tunnel rats worked by feel and instinct as much as by sight, and the tunnels were defended. The Viet Cong had developed an array of booby traps specifically designed for the confined spaces of their underground networks. Punji stakes mounted on spring-loaded mechanisms would drive through flesh before the victim could react. Venomous snakes, crates and cobras were sometimes placed in passages, their presence announced only by the rustle of scales against earth. And always, there was the possibility of encountering an enemy fighter in a space where neither man could retreat. Johnson's most terrifying descent had come in the spring of 1968. He had entered a tunnel complex near the Cambodian border, armed with only a pistol, a flashlight, and a knife. Standard procedure. Rifles were too long for the confined spaces. Even pistols had to be held at awkward angles. 20 meters into the tunnel, his flashlight had illuminated a face. The Viet Cong soldier had been waiting in an alcove, motionless, his own weapon raised. For a moment that lasted an eternity, the two men had stared at each other across a distance of less than 3 feet. Johnson could see the whites of the man's eyes, the sweat on his forehead, the slight tremor in his hands. Then both men fired. Johnson survived because his bullet found its mark a fraction of a second before his enemy's. The Viet Cong soldier's round grazed his shoulder, leaving a scar he would carry for life. But the psychological wound went deeper than any bullet could reach. The tunnels represented something that American military doctrine had never adequately addressed. They were a rejection of the conventional battlefield, a declaration that the Vietnamese would fight this war on their own terms, in their own element. All the bombs and artillery and napalm in the American arsenal could not reach an enemy who had simply gone underground. Lieutenant Chen documented the tunnel complex for 3 hours before emerging into the sunlight. She had seen the hospitals where wounded Viet Cong received treatment by candlelight, the kitchens where rice was cooked over smokeless fires, the chambers where political officers conducted indoctrination sessions. She had seen a world that existed in parallel to the one above, a world of patience, endurance, and absolute commitment. The tunnels were not merely weapons, they were statements of will. They said that no amount of firepower could defeat an enemy willing to live like moles, to sacrifice comfort and sunlight and open air for the chance to continue fighting. They said that this war would be won not by the side with the most technology, but by the side with the most determination. And in that message, American soldiers found one of their deepest fears realized. By 1969, the nature of the war had become clear to those who fought it. This was not a conflict that would be won through decisive battles or territorial conquest. It was a war of attrition, of patience, of will, and the weapons that defined it were those that embodied that reality. Corporal James Mitchell had survived 2 tours in Vietnam. He had seen friends die from punji steaks and bouncing betties. He had watched napalm transform landscapes into moonscapes. He had heard the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire in 100 different ambushes. He had even volunteered for a tunnel-clearing operation, though he never spoke of what he found below. Now, preparing to rotate home, he understood something that would take years to fully articulate. The most feared weapons of the Vietnam War were not merely instruments of death. They were expressions of a philosophy of warfare that American military doctrine had never anticipated. The punji steak said that patience could defeat technology. The tunnel said that determination could defeat firepower. The AK-47 said that simplicity could defeat sophistication. And napalm, perhaps the most American of all the weapons used in the conflict, said that even overwhelming force had its limits. Mitchell thought about the young soldiers arriving in country, fresh from training bases where they had learned to fight a different kind of war. They would learn, as he had learned, that survival in Vietnam required adapting to an enemy who refused to fight by the rules. They would learn to fear the ground beneath their feet, the jungle around them, and the darkness that could hide 1,000 threats. Some would not survive the learning. The war had changed everyone who fought it. American soldiers, who arrived believing in the righteousness of their cause, often left questioning everything they had been taught about warfare, about their country, and about themselves. Vietnamese civilians, caught between the two sides, suffered in ways that statistics could never capture. And the weapons, those terrible, ingenious, devastating weapons, had become symbols of a conflict that defied easy understanding. Mitchell boarded the transport plane that would carry him back to the world. Below, the Vietnamese landscape stretched to the horizon, green and beautiful and scarred by years of conflict. Somewhere down there the tunnels still waited, the traps were still set. The next generation of fighters was being trained in the ways of guerrilla warfare. The weapons would endure long after the soldiers who wielded them were gone. Decades later, the veterans gathered at the memorial in Washington. The black granite wall stretched before them, bearing the names of 58,000 Americans who had not come home. They stood in silence, these men who had once been young, their faces now weathered by time and memory. Marcus Williams was there. He had become a high school history teacher, spending his career trying to explain to students what no classroom could truly convey. The sound of the AK-47 still visited him in dreams, though less frequently now than in those first terrible years after his return. David Chen attended, walking with the limp that napalm's aftermath had indirectly caused, not from burns, but from a fall during the nightmares that plagued him for years. He had found peace eventually, through therapy and family and the slow healing that time sometimes permits. Robert Johnson, the tunnel rat, stood apart from the others. He had never fully readjusted to life above ground. Enclosed spaces still triggered panic attacks, but he came to the memorial every year to remember the men who had descended into the darkness and never emerged. They did not speak of the weapons directly. They did not need to. Every man present understood what they had faced, the pungy stakes that had turned the earth itself into an enemy, the napalm that had rained fire from the sky, the AK-47s that had announced death with their distinctive sound, the tunnels that had hidden an enemy who could not be found, could not be defeated, could only be endured. These weapons had shaped them in ways that peace could never fully undo. The Vietnam War had ended, but its lessons remained. Warfare in the modern age would never again be a simple contest of armies. The weapons that proved most effective were often those that cost the least and required only human ingenuity and will. Technology could be countered by patience. Firepower could be negated by invisibility, and the most powerful military in history could be fought to a standstill by an enemy who refused to play by its rules. The veterans touched the names on the wall. Friends, brothers, men who had died too young in a war that still defied easy explanation. The granite was cool beneath their fingers, solid and permanent, a reminder that some things endured beyond the chaos of conflict. The most feared weapons of the Vietnam War had not been the largest or the most sophisticated. They had been the ones that exploited every vulnerability, that transformed the environment itself into an instrument of death, that required nothing more than determination and the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. In the end, those weapons had taught a generation of Americans that war was not what they had imagined it to be. It was not glory or adventure or the triumph of good over evil. It was fear and mud and the constant presence of death. It was watching friends die and wondering if you would be next. It was coming home changed in ways that those who stayed behind could never understand. The sun set over the memorial as the veterans began to disperse. They would return to their lives, to families and jobs, and the ordinary rhythms of peacetime existence. But they would carry with them always the memory of what they had faced in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam. The weapons were gone now, rusting in museums or buried in the earth that had witnessed so much suffering. But their echoes remained. In the dreams of those who survived, in the grief of those who lost loved ones, and in the history books that would try imperfectly to explain what had happened and why. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, and the experience of the Vietnam War had taught its survivors that the most feared weapons were not always the ones that made the loudest noise. Sometimes they were the ones that waited in silence, patient, invisible, and absolutely certain of their purpose. The memorial stood in darkness as the last visitors departed. The names on the wall glowed faintly in the reflected light of the city, a permanent testament to the cost of war. And somewhere, in the hearts of those who remembered, the weapons of Vietnam continued their silent work, shaping memory, haunting dreams, and reminding the world that some wounds never fully heal. If you watched this far, it's because these stories resonate with something deep inside you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and know who truly values the stories on this channel. If this video moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear these forgotten truths of history. Every like and share helps these stories reach more people who deserve to know what really happened. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. History has countless stories still waiting to be told. Stories of courage, fear, sacrifice, and the weapons that shape the world we live in today. Don't miss a single one. Until the next story, until the next truth revealed.